Welcome to the second Tech Talk session on Pega Gen AI Socrates. My name is Caitlin Watanasiri. I'm a senior principal curriculum developer for platform enablement, and I'm joined by my colleague Sue Lipa, who is a senior curriculum developer for platform enablement. In the previous session, Chris and CJ talked about the background of the Socrates project from inception and a little bit about its development. In this session, we're going to talk about the content authoring side and about the student experience. So to get us started, Sue, as a reminder, can you tell us what Socrates is and how it differs from traditional enablement?
Hi, Caitlin. As most of you know, our traditional enablement content, like our system architect mission, is based on text, images, videos, knowledge checks, quiz, and a mission test to test your understanding, and some challenges. All of this enables the learner to have a basic understanding of the content associated with the system architect mission, but every learner is required to go through the mission in the same way. They all have to proceed through the content in exactly the same format. They have to read it, take the quizzes, etc. Socrates turns that model on its head, enabling learners to have a dynamic, scenario-based enablement experience that is driven by an interactive conversation with Socrates. And so the learner can engage in a two-way conversation with Socrates as they go through the content, evaluating their gaps in their knowledge and learning new concepts as they go along.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like Socrates provides students with a much more dynamic experience than what they were seeing in traditional enablement. So that's awesome. And so from what I'm hearing, it sounds like this dynamic, tailored experience was one goal of the project, but could you tell me a little bit about some of the other goals that you all had?
Absolutely. Ultimately, the goal of Socrates was to enable our learners with a deeper understanding of Pega Platform in less time. What we are doing to do that is Pega's Gen AI or generative AI learning capabilities. Gen AI allows us to develop our enablement content, the Socrates content, faster. It also makes that content much easier to update to keep up with the dramatic pace of change that's going on in our platform side of the business. But also, Gen AI allows the learner's experience to change, and they can consume the content more quickly and in a style that is tailored to both their knowledge level and their preferred way of learning, their preferred tone or their preferred industry.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I think we all know Gen AI is a hot topic these days, so it only made sense that the team was interested in finding an innovative and interesting way to see if they could use it to enhance enablement. So
Exactly.
awesome. Yeah. And so I also know that some of the content sources that you all used for Socrates was a bit more closely aligned with Pega's technical documentation. Can you talk about that and how it maybe connects to some of those goals that you mentioned?
Absolutely. So traditionally, both our enablement teams and the technical documentation teams would work with product owners to understand what was happening in the platform, what existing products, how they functioned, what new products were coming on, and we would create our content somewhat independently. Now, after kind of seeing that both our content and TechDoc's content has contextual as well as instructional, we decided to eliminate some of the duplication and make technical content our source of truth for Socrates and how Socrates gets its knowledge. Our Socratic missions also use the technical documentation to support our challenges. Traditionally, the challenges in our content were delivered by providing the learner with step-by-step instructions on how to do a task. Our challenges are now using a concept called journey maps, where we provide learners with the links to the technical documentation they need to complete a challenge. And this enables learners to use the technical documentation and be comfortable with the technical documentation before they go on to be business architects or system architects or whatever their Pega role demands. And as anybody who's done software development knows, understanding and being able to work with the technical documentation is critical to being able to do your job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, as you mentioned, our product documentation is really excellent. So it has so much great content. So I'm glad we were able to reuse that. It's more efficient to reuse content that's already existing. So yeah, that's awesome.
Absolutely. I think it benefits both the enablement team and the technical documentation team when we have one source of truth.
For sure.
And ultimately the learner.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that System Architect is one of our most consumed missions on Pega Academy. Why did the team choose to use that mission as their first to launch Socrates?
Absolutely. So not only is it one of the most consumed missions on Pega Academy, but it has one of the widest breadth of learners. It goes everyone from learners with no technical experience and no Pega experience to learners who have considerable Pega experience and are just working towards their certification, right? So given that breadth of learners and the ability to be able to engage with Socrates in a two-way conversation that focuses on your knowledge gaps, it makes System Architect the ideal mission to see and kind of test out how this new learning style works for enablement and Pega platform.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. You've also mentioned in the conversation a few times how Socrates can tailor the learning experience for students. Can you elaborate about how Socrates can do that?
Absolutely. So at the start of a module, every learner gets the opportunity to select their language, to select their conversation style, everything from beginner level to highly technical, and they can also select their preferred industry. This way, when Socrates engages with them in a two-way conversation, it communicates with them in an industry that they are comfortable with when they're asked to evaluate the scenario, but also in a tone that they understand. And a new learner wouldn't want to engage in a highly technical conversation. That might be confusing, but an experienced Pega learner that is comfortable with the Pega terminology right off the bat would be able to engage in Socrates in a much more robust manner. So Socrates really allows us some flexibility in that line that a traditional enablement context that's text-based does not.
Right. And it's giving them a scenario that they're very familiar with. It'll be a richer learning experience for them because it's relevant to them.
Exactly.
Awesome. It all sounds great, but are there challenges that you've encountered for scenario-based learning?
Yeah, there are a few. So one of the things about a scenario is that we can't provide a scenario for every industry in our Socratic content when we develop it. So we provide a basic scenario, and then Socrates is able to use its understanding of business and its training to tailor that scenario to the learner's chosen industry. We had to walk a fine line between giving Socrates the freedom to be able to provide that scenario in the industry, but not so much freedom that it would start to hallucinate either about what was happening in that industry or maybe some of Pega Platform's capabilities. So it took definitely some trial and error and some robust testing with the different LLM, the different large language learning models that that Socrates uses to kind of figure out what model and what parameter allowed the freedom to deliver a robust scenario, but not so much freedom that there were hallucinations. It took a while, but we did get there. I think it's delivering on our mandate for a solid scenario-based learning experience.
Awesome. Yeah. We don't want any hallucinations.
No one likes a hallucination.
All right. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about some of the main goals of Socrates. And now can we talk a little bit about the learning experience? So if I were a student who is taking a Socratic module, how would that experience be like for me?
Absolutely. Let's get into that a little more deeply. So if you, when you first engage with a Socratic module, like I said, you get to choose your language, your tone, your conversation style, and your industry. But then when the Socratic module really kicks off, You indicate whether you are a learner that has some experience in the topic covered by the module, or you do not have experience in the topic covered by the module. If you do have experience, then the Socrates module goes right into the scenario that you're presented with. The scenario is kind of related to the topic being covered. And then you are asked a series of questions related to the scenario that are used to evaluate your understanding of that topic, right? You go through and answer the series of questions. Socrates does an evaluation, and then you proceed to the Socratic conversation, and that Socratic conversation is based on the learning objectives that Socrates felt you did not demonstrate a mastery of. And so that becomes the basis of your learning. If you are a new learner, your experience with Socrates starts with some introductory content. The introductory content is more like our traditional content, where there's some text, there's videos, there's images that gives that learner a baseline for the topic being covered in that module. And so after you get through the introductory content, when you are presented with the scenario and the questions that the evaluation is going to be based on, that new learner has an understanding of the questions they're being asked and the kind of content and the content they need to answer the questions with. And then again, just like an experienced learner, that scenario and those questions are evaluated, and then the Socratic conversation proceeds to provide more knowledge to the learner about those learning objectives with which they did not demonstrate mastery from the scenario question evaluation portion.
Got it. Awesome. I noticed you mentioned a couple times about how the conversations are very interactive, or they're two-way between the learner and Socrates. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Absolutely. And in almost every one of the three different sections, whether it's the introductory content or the scenario and question evaluation portion, or the Socratic conversation, not only does Socrates ask the learners questions to demonstrate or to determine if they understand the content, but the learner also gets to ask Socrates questions and ask them to elaborate on the content being covered. If they feel a certain concept they need more information on, or if they need Socrates to provide an analogy to help with understanding, they can ask for that information. And so it is not only Socrates asking them question after question, they can ask for clarification, allowing them to learn throughout the process. Now, I will say that Socrates does operate in a limited data mode. Unfortunately, you cannot ask Socrates where you should go for dinner that night, or if you're going to need an umbrella when you leave the house, but it will engage with you on any PEGA-related question. And that is where Socrates interacts with the technical documentation. That's where Socrates is drawing on its knowledge to answer those questions for the learner.
Yeah. So like a good tutor, Socrates will answer your questions if you need help with something, but it's going to make sure your conversation stays on track. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Exactly.
Great. So I know personally that you were very heavily involved in the development of the Socratic content, like from the curriculum side. So could you tell us now about the content authoring side of a Socratic module?
Absolutely. So when we went through and tried to figure out how we were going to take our traditional enablement content that was based on modules and topics, we decided that we were going to tailor our Socratic learning experience on learning objectives. Learning objectives are measurable guidelines for determining mastery of a topic. Each learning objective then is based on a series of proof points. And proof points are specific elements of knowledge that the learner must demonstrate an understanding of for Socrates to determine whether or not they understand the learning objective. right? So what we did is we converted each module worth of content into a series of learning objectives and proof points. And we structured those learning objectives and proof points around Bloom's taxonomy, where we try and make the early learning objectives and the early proof points more about understanding things on a fundamental level, asking them to define or explain. And then as they progress through the learning objectives and proof points, we ask their understanding to become more complex, having them discuss or compare or even provide a use case or examples based on their experience, or even using the scenario that they were presented with as at the beginning of the module.
Cool. Yeah, I always find it interesting to hear how the back end compares to the front end. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think we all know projects rarely stay exactly the same form that, like when you're planning, it's not always the same from planning to, when it's actually launched. So can you give us any tidbits about how the project may have changed or how information you presented to students changed?
Absolutely. So, so from our initial proof of concept of Socrates, we stuck with the concept of the scenario and scenario questions for the evaluation and learning objectives and proof points. But our very robust group of testers from Pega, who were very patient with us and very forthcoming and forthright with information, both good and bad, about their experience, we learned that new learners who were presented right off the bat with a scenario and asked a series of Pega-specific challenges were extremely frustrated. They did not have an understanding of the topic or a baseline from which to work from. They found it to be a very frustrating experience. From that feedback, the concept of the introductory content was born, right? We needed to provide new learners with a basis for understanding the information that would be presented in that module and what they would be asked to demonstrate knowledge of. And so by adding an introductory content section and experience to the overall Socratic learning style, we were able to really turn what was a very frustrating experience into new learners into a very positive experience. We were able to use some of the content from our traditional enablement to make sure it was good, it was solid, it matched up with TextDocs. We could do it relatively quickly, but it really was an iteration on the Socratic learning tool that added a tremendous amount of value, and it's completely based on user feedback during the testing phase.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, we definitely don't want students to feel lost, so it sounds like that was a great change.
Yeah.
Yeah. So aside from introductory content, what were some other things that maybe from testing feedback or trial and error that you ended up changing, and could you tell us about that?
Absolutely. There was a lot of trial and error around the learning objectives and proof points, specifically the number of them. It was a bit like Goldilocks, I like to think of it, right? There were times when there were just too many learning objectives and too many proof points in a module, and it was very frustrating for learners of all experience levels to get through. And then there were some modules that were developed with too few learning objectives and too few proof points, and you got new learners who are like, I got through the module, but I'm not really sure I understand all the nuances and the concepts. So it took a while to kind of figure out what the sweet spot was for each module in terms of number of learning objectives and number of proof points per learning objective to make the experience robust, but not so frustrating that learners didn't feel like they were making progress working through the module. We did eventually settle on about 4 to 5 proof points per learning objective and about 4 to 5 proof points 4 or 5 learning objectives per module, and that seems to deliver the kind of experience we want for learners.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. All right, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the future of Socrates at Pega. So what additional content or missions are we going to expect to see on Socrates next?
Absolutely. So there's been a lot of interest, as you would imagine, given the popularity and the success of Socrates at PegaWorld. I think one of the first modules that will be presented next in Socrates is going to be Blueprint. I think the incredible pace of development in the Blueprint SaaS application lends itself very well to Socratic learning. Especially in that we can use the technical documentation which underlies the rollout. I mean, people have to have technical documentation to know how to use it. The Socratic modules can capitalize on that technical documentation and produce a module for a wide scope of learners across Pega and beyond to understand how Blueprint works and operates, and we can keep up with the very rapid pace of change. Additional content that is people are interested in getting out in the Socratic style include Customer Decision Hub, customer service, and we've gotten people some interest from sales enablement. They want to be able to roll that out, and business architects, which are very similar to system architects in some capacity, are also extremely interested. So we should start seeing more Socratic modules here as we get through the end of 24 and into 25.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of excitement around Socrates, and so it's great to hear that there are more modules and missions coming.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Aside from new content being added, how do you see the Socratic modules themselves changing in the near future?
One of the biggest updates and improvements we hope to implement in hopefully in closer to a near term is having Socrates surface more relevant images and videos. We have images and videos incorporated in the introductory context section, but we want to Socrates to be able to implement them more in the Socratic conversation portion of the learning, just to accommodate people who are more visual learners. From our traditional enablement content, we have a lot of images and videos in our stores of knowledge, and we want to be able to surface those. Additionally, we'd like to incorporate different types of learner interactions, not all just text-based responses to questions where learners have to type. I believe there is speech to text now. We'd like to improve on that, and just other ways to make it a more dynamic interaction between Socrates and the learner to just continue to evolve the learner's ability to engage and learn in content more deeply in a more rapid time frame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a visual learner myself, so I'm excited about more images, more videos, all of that. So it's great to hear.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I know we've been getting a lot of feedback since we launched Socrates at PegaWorld. Can you share any of that feedback that you've been hearing?
The last broad representation I've heard is that generally the about 75 to 80% of the feedback responses we're getting are coming in positive, which is, I think, far exceeded anybody's expectations. I think learners are, although some are certainly frustrated by the amount of typing they have to do, we are hearing that this interactive, conversational, very dynamic learning style is allowing learners to learn Pega platform content more deeply. And the little feedback I've seen says, although journey maps are a very different way of interacting with our challenges, they are forcing learners to become comfortable with the technical documentation, and that is benefiting them beyond just doing the Socratic learning module. So that's just fabulous feedback. We're enjoying that. The negative feedback, we are taking that to heart, as we do all the feedback. So one thing I would say to anyone who is watching this Tech Talk and plans to go engage with a Socratic module, whether it be the system architect Socratic version or the smaller form Socratic module that is on the Socrates homepage, we welcome feedback. We really do want to hear what learners find both positive and negative about the experience, and that is definitely part of our planning for future iterations of Socrates. Just like with our technical enablement, we try and make sure we deliver the best enablement experience we can for Pega platform learners.
Absolutely. And yeah, there are definitely going to be more enhancements, changes, all those things coming to Pega Gen AI Socrates. So everyone stay tuned for those. And thanks again, Sue. It was really awesome working with you on this project. And thank you for sitting down with me today to talk about it.
Absolutely. It was one of the most rewarding experiences I've had at Pega. It truly changes the way we deliver our enablement content, and I think Pega Gen AI for not only enablement but for Pega in general is the future, and I'm glad we can incorporate that to improve the enablement experience for all of our learners.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you.